The early morning sun cast long shadows across the field as Frank Miller climbed into the seat of his old John Deere tractor. The metal was still cool to the touch, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Summer had arrived in full force in the quiet farming community of Riverdale, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of plowing, planting, and hoping for rain at just the right times. Frank adjusted his worn baseball cap and turned the key. The tractor rumbled to life, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. This land had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had broken the soil with horses and sweat. His father had modernized with the first tractor. Now at 53, Frank continued the tradition, though these days the work seemed harder and the rewards smaller. Just another day in paradise, Kyo, he muttered to himself, a phrase his wife always rolled her eyes at. But farming was in his blood, and despite the challenges, he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He began methodically working the eastern section of his property, a 20-acre stretch that had lain fallow last season. The plow cut into the earth, turning over rich, dark soil. The smell of freshly turned dirt filled his nostrils, earthy and honest. Frank settled into the monotonous back-and-forth pattern, his mind drifting to the list of repairs needed on the barn roof and whether the weather would hold through the weekend for his granddaughter's visit. 2 hours into his work, something happened that would change everything. The tractor suddenly jerked violently, nearly throwing Frank from his seat. The engine whined in protest as the plow struck something solid beneath the surface. What in the world? Frank killed the engine and climbed down, the sudden silence broken only by the distant call of birds and the ticking of the cooling tractor motor. He walked around to inspect the plow, expecting to find a large boulder or perhaps an old stump his father had missed years ago. What he discovered instead made him stop in his tracks. Protruding from the freshly turned earth was a massive hook, not the kind you'd use for fishing, but an industrial-sized metal hook nearly 2 feet in length. It was rusty but solid and clearly man-made. More surprising was the heavy chain attached to it, disappearing back into the unplowed ground. Frank crouched down, his work-worn hands brushing dirt from the metal. "Where did you come from?" he wondered aloud. In all his years farming this land, and all his father's years before that, no one had ever mentioned anything like this buried in the fields. He tugged experimentally on the hook. It didn't budge. Whatever was on the other end of that chain was firmly embedded in the earth. Frank straightened, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back. He scanned the flat expanse of his field, trying to make sense of his discovery. This part of the country had never been industrial. The nearest factory was 30 miles away in the next county. There were no old mining operations, no railroad spurs, nothing that would explain such a massive piece of metal equipment buried in his field. Curiosity got the better of him. Frank walked back to his tractor and retrieved a shovel from the small equipment box he kept mounted behind the seat. If he was going to solve this mystery, he'd need to see more than just the hook. As he began to dig alongside the chain, following its path, sweat beaded on his forehead and soaked through his plaid work shirt. The morning was warming up quickly, and digging by hand was no small task. Yet something drove him forward, perhaps the same pioneering spirit that had brought his grandfather to this land in the first place. Frank Miller, treasure hunter, he chuckled to himself, though the laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about finding something so completely unexpected on land he thought he knew like the back of his hand. The chain continued at a slight angle downward. After digging about 3 feet, Frank realized that whatever was at the other end must be buried deep. He returned to the tractor and maneuvered it out of the way, then resumed his excavation with renewed determination. By midday, the sun was high overhead, beating down mercilessly. Frank had removed his outer shirt, working now in just his undershirt, which was soaked through with sweat. He dug a trench nearly 5 feet long, following the chain as it continued its path downward. His hands were blistered despite his work gloves, and his back screamed in protest. He was about to take a break when he heard the rumble of a truck approaching. Looking up, he saw a dust cloud rising from his access road. The blue pickup that emerged belonged to his neighbor, Bill Thompson. Bill pulled up alongside the field and rolled down his window. "What in tarnation are you doing, Frank?" "Digging to China?" Frank straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "Found something strange while plowing. Come take a look." Bill's curiosity got the better of him. He shut off his truck and ambled over to the excavation site. His eyebrows rose as he took in the giant hook and chain. "Well, I'll be—" Bill whistled low. "Never seen anything like that around here. How far does it go?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Frank replied, gesturing to the chain disappearing into the earth. "Been digging for hours and haven't found the end yet." Bill crouched down to examine the hook more closely. "This isn't farm equipment. Looks military grade to me. Heavy duty." Frank hadn't considered that possibility. "Military? There's never been any base around here." "Not that we know of," Bill said thoughtfully. "My dad used to talk about how the government bought up land all over during the Cold War days. Secret projects and such. Most folks never knew what was happening in their own backyards." A chill ran down Frank's spine despite the heat of the day. His father had never mentioned anything about government activities on their land. But then again, there were many things the older generation kept to themselves. "Well, whatever it is, it's on my property now," Frank said with determination, "and I aim to find out what's at the other end of this chain." Bill glanced at his watch. "Got to get back to my own chores, but I'm mighty curious about this. Mind if I stop by later to see what you found?" "Be my guest," Frank replied. "Might need an extra pair of hands anyway." After Bill left, Frank retreated to the shade of a lone oak tree at the edge of the field. He drank deeply from his water jug and unwrapped the sandwich his wife had packed for him that morning. As he ate, his eyes never left the partially excavated chain. What could possibly be buried so deep in his field? And why? Lunch finished, Frank returned to his digging with renewed vigor. The chain continued its downward path, now at a steeper angle. By mid-afternoon, his trench was nearly 7 feet deep at its lowest point, and he had to construct a crude set of steps to climb in and out. The physical labor was grueling, but Frank barely noticed his exhaustion. Something primal drove him forward. The human need to know, to discover, to solve the mystery literally buried in his own backyard. As the afternoon wore on, several cars slowed as they passed by on the country road. Word spread quickly in small communities, and an unusual sight like a farmer digging a deep trench in the middle of his field was bound to attract attention. Frank ignored the onlookers. His world had narrowed to the rusted chain and whatever secret it held. Each shovelful of dirt brought him closer to answers. Just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Frank's shovel struck something solid. It wasn't the dull thud of striking stone, but a hollow, metallic sound that resonated up through the handle of the shovel and into his arms. Heart pounding, he dropped to his knees and began clearing away soil with his hands. Bit by bit, he uncovered what appeared to be a flat metal surface. The chain disappeared into it through what looked like some kind of sealed entry point. Frank sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery. This was no farming equipment accidentally buried and forgotten. This was something deliberately hidden beneath his land. Something large and man-made, buried deep enough that normal farming activities would never disturb it. As the implications began to sink in, Frank felt the blood drain from his face. His hands trembled slightly as he brushed away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be the edge of the metal structure. It extended beyond the width of his trench in both directions. Whatever lay beneath his field, it was massive. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke his concentration. Bill was back, this time with Frank's wife Linda in the passenger seat. Frank climbed out of the trench, suddenly aware of how filthy and exhausted he must look. "Bill called and told me what you found," Linda said as she approached. "I thought you were just plowing today." "That was the plan," Frank replied, gesturing toward the excavation. "But then I found this." Linda peered into the trench, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "What is it?" "Don't know yet," Frank admitted. "But I just hit what feels like the main part." "It's big, Linda, really big." Bill joined them at the edge of the hole. "Hit pay dirt, did you?" Frank nodded. "There's something metal down there, and it's not small." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, staring at the excavation as the setting sun cast long shadows across the field. "Maybe we should call someone," Linda suggested quietly. "The police or—" "And tell them what?" Frank asked. "That I found a giant hook in my field and decided to dig it up?" "Better safe than sorry," Bill offered. "Could be anything down there. Old fuel tanks, military equipment like I mentioned earlier." Frank nodded slowly, the initial excitement of discovery giving way to caution. What had seemed like an adventure now felt increasingly ominous. He glanced at his dirt-encrusted hands and then back at the metal surface partially revealed in the deepening shadows of the trench. Tomorrow, he decided. We'll call someone tomorrow. But tonight, I need to see just a little more of what we're dealing with. As he climbed back into the trench with a flashlight, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his simple farming life was about to become much more complicated. The flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness as Frank carefully made his way back down into the trench. Above him, Linda and Bill watched with concerned expressions, their faces illuminated by the fading sunset. The evening air had grown cooler, bringing welcome relief after the scorching day. "Be careful down there," Linda called, wrapping her arms around herself despite the lingering warmth. Frank nodded without looking up, his attention fixed on the metal surface he'd uncovered. With the flashlight held between his teeth, he used his hands to clear away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be some kind of hatch or door. The heavy chain disappeared into a circular opening at its center. "What do you see?" Bill's voice echoed down into the excavation. Frank removed the flashlight from his mouth. "Looks like some kind of door or hatch. Industrial grade. Not something you'd find on a farm." He ran his fingers along what appeared to be a seam. Whatever this is, it was meant to stay hidden. As he brushed away more soil, his fingers found what felt like engraved lettering. Frank directed his flashlight beam at the spot and froze. Barely visible beneath decades of dirt were faded symbols and what looked like official government markings. "Bill," he called up, his voice steadier than he felt. "You might have been right about the military connection." Bill's face appeared at the edge of the trench. "Government markings? Something like that. Can't make much out, but it's definitely not farm equipment." Linda joined Bill at the edge. "Frank, please come up. It's getting dark, and whatever's down there has been buried for years. It can wait until morning." Frank was about to protest when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Near the edge of the hatch was a faded symbol he recognized, a warning sign for hazardous materials. His grandfather had worked briefly at a chemical plant, and Frank had seen similar warnings posted throughout the facility during childhood visits. "I'm coming up," he said, suddenly eager to be out of the hole. Once back on solid ground, Frank explained what he'd seen to Linda and Bill. The three stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "We need to call someone," Linda said firmly. "Tonight, not tomorrow." This time, Frank didn't argue. "Who exactly do we call about something like this?" "Sheriff's office is the logical place to start," Bill suggested. "They can bring in whoever else needs to be involved." Frank nodded, brushing dirt from his clothes. "Let's head back to the house and make that call. And maybe we should put up something to keep folks away from this hole until we know what we're dealing with." Using the headlights from Bill's truck, they gathered the warning signs Frank kept in his equipment shed and placed them around the excavation site. The bright orange diamonds looked eerily out of place in the peaceful farm field. Back at the farmhouse, Frank washed up while Linda called the county sheriff's office. He could hear her explaining the situation, her voice rising with frustration as she apparently struggled to make the dispatcher understand the seriousness of their discovery. "Yes, that's right," she was saying as Frank entered the kitchen. "My husband found a large hook and chain while plowing, and he followed it to what appears to be some kind of buried structure with government markings. No, we're not pulling a prank. Yes, we'll be here." She hung up with a sigh. "They're sending Deputy Rogers out, but the dispatcher thought we were playing some kind of joke." Bill, who had followed them back to the house, shook his head. "Not surprising. Nothing like this has ever happened around here." Frank sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he felt. His muscles ached from the hours of digging, and his mind raced with questions about what lay beneath his field. Land that had been in his family for generations now felt strange and unfamiliar. "Coffee?" Linda offered, already moving to the pot. "Something stronger might be in order," Frank replied with a weak smile. While they waited for the deputy, they gathered around the kitchen table speculating about what Frank might have discovered. "Could be an old bunker," Bill suggested. "Government built thousands of them during the Cold War. Fallout shelters, storage facilities, all sorts of things. But why on our land?" Linda asked. "And wouldn't someone have told us it was there?" Frank shook his head. "Dad never mentioned anything like this. Neither did Grandpa, at least not that I can recall." "Lots of secrecy back then," Bill said. "My uncle worked construction on government projects in the 50s. Said sometimes they'd build things and not even the workers knew what they were for. They'd work on one section, then get moved somewhere else so no single person knew the whole layout. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Through the window they could see the sheriff's department SUV pulling into the driveway, its headlights illuminating the yard. Deputy Rogers was a young man who had only been with the department for a few years. Frank knew him mainly from community events and the occasional traffic stop. The deputy approached the house with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism written across his face. "Evening, folks," he said as Linda showed him in. "Dispatcher said something about finding government property buried in your field." Frank nodded, gesturing for the deputy to sit. "Found it while plowing today. Giant hook attached to a chain that led to what looks like some kind of metal hatch or door, buried about 7 feet down." Deputy Rogers pulled out a notepad. "And you're certain this isn't old farm equipment? Sometimes previous owners bury all sorts of things." "This isn't a plow or tractor part," Frank said firmly. "It has government markings and hazard symbols on it." That caught the deputy's attention. "Hazard symbols? What kind?" "The kind that warn about dangerous materials," Frank replied. "Like you'd see at a chemical plant or military facility." Deputy Rogers' expression shifted from skeptical to concerned. "I think I'd better take a look at this. Do you mind if we drive out there now?" Despite the late hour, they all piled into vehicles. Frank and Linda in their truck, Bill in his, and the deputy following behind. The headlights cut through the darkness as they made their way back to the field. The night had grown quite dark, with clouds obscuring the stars and moon. At the excavation site, Deputy Rogers examined the trench with his powerful flashlight. Frank could see the moment when the young man's demeanor changed from professional courtesy to genuine alarm. "Mr. Miller," he said, climbing back out of the hole. "I need to call this in, right away." While the deputy returned to his vehicle to radio for backup, Frank, Linda, and Bill stood silently at the edge of the field. "What do you think it is?" Linda asked quietly. Frank shook his head. "No idea. But I've got a feeling our lives are about to get a lot more complicated." Within an hour, the quiet country road leading to the Miller farm had become a parade of official vehicles. The county sheriff himself arrived, followed by fire department hazmat teams and eventually black SUVs with government plates. Men and women in various uniforms consulted in hushed tones near the excavation site, which was now illuminated by portable floodlights. Frank, Linda, and Bill had been politely but firmly asked to wait by the farmhouse, where they now stood watching the activity from a distance. "Never seen anything like this," the sheriff said, approaching them after a lengthy discussion with a stern-looking man in a dark suit. "Folks from the federal government are taking over. They've got records indicating there was some kind of facility buried on this property." "What kind of facility?" Frank demanded. "It's my land. I have a right to know." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "They're not sharing much information with me either. But they've asked that you all stay in the house while they secure the site. Someone will be in to talk with you shortly." As the sheriff walked away, Linda gripped Frank's arm. "What have we stumbled into?" Frank had no answer. The farmland that had been his family's livelihood for generations now crawled with strangers in protective gear. Portable generators hummed in the distance, powering the bright lights that made the night scene look like something from a movie. An hour later, a knock at the door revealed the stern-looking man Frank had seen talking with the sheriff. He introduced himself simply as Agent Clark. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he began, declining their offer to sit. "I understand this situation must be confusing and concerning for you. I'm here to provide what information I can." "Which I'm guessing isn't much," Frank said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Agent Clark's expression remained neutral, more than you might expect. "The facility beneath your field was constructed in 1954 as part of a national defense initiative. It was decommissioned in 1972, and according to our records, the property owners at that time were informed and compensated." Frank exchanged a glance with Linda. "That would have been my father. He never mentioned anything like this to me." "There would have been a non-disclosure agreement involved," Agent Clark explained. "Many civilians felt it was their patriotic duty to keep such matters confidential, especially during that era." "What exactly is down there?" Linda asked. Agent Clark hesitated. "A storage facility for sensitive materials. I'm not at liberty to be more specific at this time, but I can assure you there's no immediate danger to you or surrounding properties." "No immediate danger?" Frank repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to conduct a thorough assessment before we can provide more details," Agent Clark replied. For now, we're establishing a security perimeter. We'll need you to relocate temporarily while we work. Frank felt his temper rising. This is my home. My livelihood. You can't just... The government will compensate you for any inconvenience or lost income, Agent Clark interrupted smoothly. And I can assure you this is being handled at the highest levels of authority. As Frank opened his mouth to protest further, Linda placed a calming hand on his arm. How long will this take? She asked. Difficult to say until we complete our initial assessment, Agent Clark replied. Days, possibly weeks. Frank looked out the window at the floodlit scene that had transformed his quiet farm into what resembled a military operation. Whatever lay beneath his field had been quietly hidden there throughout his childhood, throughout his father's lifetime of working the land. The thought made him feel as though the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. We don't have much choice, do we? He asked, already knowing the answer. Agent Clark's expression softened slightly. No, Mr. Miller, I'm afraid you don't. But I give you my word we'll treat your property with respect and keep you informed as much as possible. As the agent turned to leave, Frank called after him. That hook and chain, what were they for? Agent Clark paused at the door. An emergency retrieval system, in case what's buried needed to be accessed quickly. He glanced back at Frank. Let's just hope it never came to that. With those ominous words hanging in the air, he stepped out into the night, leaving Frank and Linda to wonder what secrets had been lying beneath their feet all these years. The Country Inn motel on the outskirts of town had seen better days. The faded blue carpet in room 114 had worn thin in places, and the air conditioner rattled like it might give up any minute. For Frank and Linda Miller, it was a far cry from the farmhouse that had been their home for over 30 years. 3 days now, Frank said, looking out the window toward the parking lot where his pickup truck sat gathering dust. 3 days and they still won't let us back on our own property. Linda looked up from the small table where she was writing a list of items they needed to pick up from the store. Agent Clark said it could be weeks, Frank. We need to be patient. Frank turned from the window, frustration etched across his weathered face. Patient? They've got our farm surrounded with security fencing and armed guards. They're digging up who knows what, and all we get are these vague daily updates that tell us nothing. He picked up the latest briefing paper they'd received that morning. The official government letterhead did little to disguise the fact that the actual information provided was minimal at best. Work continues on assessment and extraction. Security protocols remain in effect. Compensation processing underway, he read aloud. What does that even mean? Linda set down her pen with a sigh. It means they're still figuring it out themselves. And it means we're getting paid for our trouble, which is something at least. The compensation checks had indeed started arriving, generous ones at that. But money couldn't replace the sense of violation Frank felt. The land that had been passed down through generations of his family now felt like it belonged to strangers in hazmat suits and government badges. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Frank opened it to find Bill, holding a box of donuts and a thermos. Thought you two might want some decent coffee, he said, stepping inside. That stuff from the lobby tastes like it was brewed last week. You're a lifesaver, Linda said, clearing space on the table for their impromptu breakfast. Bill had been their most consistent visitor during their forced relocation, bringing news from town and providing a welcome distraction from the uncertainty of their situation. Anything new? Frank asked as he poured the steaming coffee into the motel's cheap plastic cups. Bill shook his head. Nothing official, but there's plenty of talk around town. Some folks are saying it's an old weapons cache. Others think it's chemical waste. Tom from the hardware store is convinced it's a secret underground base where they kept aliens. Despite his mood, Frank couldn't help but smile. Tom always did have an active imagination. People are curious, Bill continued more seriously. Can't blame them. Half the county's seen the government vehicles coming and going from your place. Never had anything like this happen around here before. Linda frowned. Has there been any talk about other properties? If there's something like this on our land, could there be more buried elsewhere? It was a question that had been bothering Frank as well. Their farm wasn't unique, just one of dozens of similar properties dotting the rural landscape. If his father had made some secret arrangement with the government, who's to say other farmers hadn't done the same? Nothing concrete, Bill replied. But people are looking at their land differently now. Pete Wilson was out with a metal detector in his back 40 yesterday. Said he was just being thorough. Frank shook his head. This whole situation has everyone on edge. After breakfast, Frank decided he needed some air. The walls of the motel room felt like they were closing in after days of confinement. Linda opted to stay behind to call their daughter, who had been worried since hearing about the situation. Frank and Bill walked across the street to the small park that served as the town's gathering place. The morning was pleasant, with a gentle breeze rustling through the oak trees that provided shade for the scattered benches. I keep thinking about what Agent Clark said, Frank mused as they walked, about my father knowing about this facility, about him being compensated and signing some non-disclosure agreement. Bill nodded. Hard to imagine your old man keeping something like that secret all those years. That's just it, Frank said. My father wasn't the type for secrets. He was straightforward, practical. If the government had approached him about something like this, I would have expected him to tell them to take a hike. Times were different back then, Bill reminded him. Cold War and all that. A lot of folks saw cooperation with the government as their patriotic duty. Frank shook his head. Not my father. Not about his land. He paused at a bench and sat down, his mind racing. Something doesn't add up, Bill. Before Bill could respond, Frank's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Miller, came a familiar voice when he answered. This is Agent Clark. We've made significant progress in our assessment. I'd like to meet with you and your wife this afternoon to discuss some findings. Would 3 o'clock work for you? Frank felt a surge of both hope and apprehension. We'll be there. The local library had a small conference room that Agent Clark had commandeered for their meeting. Frank and Linda arrived early, both nervous about what they might learn. Agent Clark arrived precisely at 3. Accompanied by an older man he introduced as Dr. Howard, a historian specializing in Cold War military installations. Thank you for coming, Agent Clark began once they were all seated. As I mentioned, we've made progress in understanding what's beneath your property. Dr. Howard opened a folder and slid some black and white photographs across the table. They showed construction work being done on what appeared to be large metal containers being lowered into the ground. These were taken in 1954, he explained. The facility on your land was part of a network of secure storage sites established throughout the Midwest during the early Cold War period. Frank studied the photos closely. What exactly were they storing? Dr. Howard and Agent Clark exchanged glances. The installation was designed to house specialized equipment and materials considered vital to national security, Agent Clark said carefully. Some of it was classified as hazardous, which explains the warning symbols you observed. Was it weapons? Linda asked directly. Nuclear materials. Dr. Howard cleared his throat. Not nuclear, no. But the materials stored there were considered sensitive enough that extraordinary measures were taken to secure them. Frank was growing tired of the vague responses. Look, this is my land we're talking about. My family has worked it for generations. I deserve to know exactly what's down there. Agent Clark nodded. You're right, Mr. Miller, and that's part of why we're here today. He pulled out another document. We've been searching archives to understand why there was no record of your family's awareness of the installation. We found this. He slid a faded document across the table. It was a letter dated 1972, addressed to Frank's father, Thomas Miller. Frank read it aloud. Dear Mr. Miller, this letter is to inform you that the government installation on the property, designated as Section E of your farm, has been decommissioned and sealed according to protocol. As per our agreement, all evidence of its existence has been removed from the surface. You are hereby released from your obligations under the non-disclosure agreement, dated June 12, 1954. Enclosed, please find the final compensation payment as agreed. The department thanks you for your service to your country. Frank looked up. So he did know. Yes, Agent Clark confirmed. But there's more. We found this attached to the letter. It appears to be a handwritten note from your father. The yellowed piece of paper contained just a few lines in his father's familiar handwriting. Received payment. Acknowledge decommissioning. Request all documentation of installation be removed from property records to avoid future complications for my son. Frank stared at the note, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. His father had known, had been part of whatever secret lay beneath their farm, but had tried to protect him from it. We believe your father was concerned about how this might affect the farm's future, Dr. Howard explained gently. Land with known government installations, especially those containing hazardous materials, could face regulatory complications, potential restrictions on use, even decreased value. So he tried to erase it from the records, Frank said quietly, to protect our livelihood. It appears so, Agent Clark confirmed, and he largely succeeded. The records were removed from local property documents. Unfortunately, the federal archives maintained their records, but they were misfiled and never properly cross-referenced with your property until now. Linda reached over and squeezed Frank's hand. He was trying to do what was best for you. Frank nodded slowly, still processing this revelation about his father. So what happens now? What are you finding down there? Agent Clark straightened in his chair. The good news is that our preliminary assessments show the containment systems have maintained their integrity. There's no evidence of leakage or contamination of surrounding soil. And the bad news? Linda asked. The materials inside need to be properly removed and disposed of according to current environmental standards, Dr. Howard explained. The methods used in the 1950s, while advanced for their time, don't meet today's requirements. How long will that take? Frank asked. At least another 2 weeks for the extraction, Agent Clark replied. Possibly longer for complete remediation of the site. Frank took a deep breath. And after that? What happens to our farm? Once the extraction and remediation are complete, you'll be free to return, Agent Clark assured him. The government will restore the land to its original condition, or better. You'll continue to receive compensation for the disruption, and there will be additional funds for any long-term monitoring that might be required. As they left the meeting, Frank felt both relieved and troubled. The mystery of what lay beneath his field was beginning to unravel, but it had also revealed a side of his father he'd never known. Back at the motel, he sat on the edge of the bed, holding the photocopy of his father's note that Agent Clark had allowed him to keep. He was trying to protect us, he said to Linda. All those years he never said a word because he thought it was better that way. Linda sat beside him. He did what fathers do. He tried to spare you from worrying about something he thought was handled. Frank nodded, tracing his finger over his father's handwriting. I just wish I'd known. I've been working that land for 30 years, never knowing what was right beneath my feet. Outside their window, the sun was setting over the town, casting long shadows across the motel parking lot. Somewhere across the fields, government workers continued their careful excavation of secrets long buried, secrets his father had tried to keep hidden for the sake of the future. Frank folded the paper carefully and placed it in his wallet. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask Agent Clark if he could visit the farm, not to interfere, but simply to see for himself what his father had been protecting them from all these years. Morning sunlight glinted off the chain-link fencing that now surrounded large portions of the Miller farm. Frank gazed out the window of Agent Clark's government SUV as they approached the checkpoint that had been established at the entrance to his property. Armed guards checked their identification before waving them through. We've set up quite an operation here, Agent Clark said, breaking the silence that had lingered since they'd left town. I want to thank you for your patience, Mr. Miller. Not everyone would be as understanding in your situation. Frank just nodded, his eyes fixed on the transformation of his land. The eastern field, where he'd made his discovery just over a week ago, was now unrecognizable. Large white tents had been erected around the excavation site. Trucks and equipment of various sizes dotted the landscape. Men and women in protective suits moved with purpose between stations marked with official-looking signs. Looks like a small army, Frank remarked as the vehicle came to a stop. In a way it is, Agent Clark replied. We have specialists from multiple agencies here. Environmental experts, hazardous materials teams, historical documentation units. This is one of the most intact Cold War storage facilities we've uncovered in years. They stepped out of the SUV, and Agent Clark handed Frank a hard hat and a visitor badge. You'll need to stay with me at all times. Some areas are still restricted for safety reasons. As they walked toward the main tent, Frank noticed a familiar figure in conversation with one of the technicians. Dr. Howard, the historian from yesterday's meeting, waved when he spotted them. Mr. Miller, glad you could come see our progress, he said, extending his hand. We've made some fascinating discoveries since yesterday. That's what I'm here to learn about, Frank replied, shaking the older man's hand. Dr. Howard's enthusiasm was evident as he led them toward the excavation site, now much larger than the trench Frank had dug. Steel supports braced the sides of what had become an impressive pit in the earth, with ramps leading down to the exposed metal structure below. What you found, Dr. Howard explained, was the emergency access point to a storage bunker. The hook and chain you discovered were part of the retrieval system designed to pull up sealed containers from below ground level if needed. At the edge of the excavation, they paused. From this vantage point, Frank could see that the metal hatch was actually the top of a much larger cylindrical structure, now partially unearthed. The main facility extends about 40 feet down, Agent Clark said. It consists of 3 interconnected chambers, each housing different materials. Frank felt a chill despite the morning warmth. And what exactly were they storing down there? The 2 men exchanged glances before Dr. Howard answered. A combination of things, some experimental chemical compounds, specialized communications equipment, and certain biological research materials. Biological? Frank repeated. Like viruses, bacteria? Nothing weapons grade, Agent Clark quickly clarified. This wasn't a bioweapons facility. The materials stored here were primarily for research purposes, specimens collected for study, during a period when the government was investigating defense applications for various biological processes. Frank wasn't entirely reassured. Are they dangerous? They were sealed in specialized containment vessels designed to last for centuries, Dr. Howard explained. And so far, every container we've examined has maintained its integrity. That's part of what makes this site so valuable. From a historical perspective, it's a perfectly preserved time capsule of Cold War-era research. They watched as a team in full protective gear used specialized equipment to carefully bring a sealed metal container to the surface. It was about the size of a small refrigerator, with faded markings stenciled on its sides. Each container is being cataloged and secured for transport to modern facilities. Agent Clark said, "Nothing is being opened on site." Frank thought about his father, about the secret he'd carried all those years. My father, how involved was he in all this? Dr. Howard pulled a tablet from his bag and brought up some documents. From what we've pieced together, Thomas Miller was approached in 1954 because his land had the right geological characteristics for this type of storage. Deep, stable soil composition, minimal risk of flooding, and relatively isolated. He scrolled through more documents. Your father was paid well for the use of his land, but his role was primarily just to allow access during the construction phase and then maintain secrecy afterward. He wasn't involved in the actual operations. Frank nodded, feeling some relief. That sounds more like him. If you'd like, Agent Clark offered, we can provide you with copies of all the documentation we've found regarding your father's arrangement with the government. It might help fill in some of the blanks. I'd appreciate that, Frank said. As they continued their tour of the site, Frank was introduced to various specialists who explained aspects of their work. An environmental scientist named Dr. Chen showed him the soil testing process they were conducting to ensure no contamination had occurred. We're taking samples at regular intervals in all directions from the facility, she explained. So far, everything looks clean. The containment systems did their job. A historical preservation officer named Wilson was carefully documenting each item brought to the surface, photographing and logging them before they were packed for transport. This is an invaluable window into scientific approaches from that era, he told Frank with obvious excitement. Some of these preservation methods were far ahead of their time. By midday, they had completed their circuit of the main operational areas. Frank's mind was swimming with information, trying to reconcile the high-tech excavation before him with the simple farm he'd known all his life. They stopped at a small trailer that had been set up as a break area for the workers. Inside, Agent Clark offered Frank coffee and a sandwich from the catering service that was feeding the teams. I know this is a lot to take in, he said as they sat at a folding table, but I want to assure you that once our work is complete, your land will be restored. The government takes its obligations seriously in that regard. Frank sipped his coffee, thinking. You mentioned monitoring earlier. What does that mean for the future of the farm? Minimal impact, Agent Clark replied. Small, unobtrusive monitoring wells will be installed at strategic points. They'll be checked quarterly for the first few years, then annually after that. They won't interfere with farming operations, Dr. Howard, who had joined them for lunch, added. It's standard procedure for sites like this. Even when we're confident everything's been removed properly, think of it as an abundance of caution. Frank nodded slowly. And the compensation you mentioned? Being processed now, Agent Clark confirmed. You'll receive payment for the current disruption, plus an easement fee for the monitoring stations. The total package is quite generous. Frank wasn't primarily concerned about the money, but it was good to know they wouldn't face financial hardship from this unexpected turn of events. As they finished their meal, Agent Clark received a call that drew him outside. Dr. Howard took the opportunity to speak more personally with Frank. I've been studying these Cold War installations for decades, he said, and I've met many families in situations similar to yours. Finding out your property held such secrets can be unsettling. Frank appreciated the historian's understanding. I keep thinking about my father. 30 years he kept this secret even from me, even when he was teaching me everything else about running the farm. Dr. Howard nodded sympathetically. The men of that generation took their promises to the government very seriously. He probably thought he was protecting you, and in many ways he was. The fewer people who knew, the less risk there was of accidental exposure. Exposure to what, though? Frank asked. Everyone keeps dancing around exactly what's down there. The older man hesitated. The official classification still limits what I can share, but I'll tell you this. During the early Cold War, there was significant concern about potential biological threats from rival powers. The materials stored here were part of defensive research programs, understanding potential threats so we could develop protections against them. Frank considered this. So not weapons, but research on how to defend against them? Essentially, yes, Dr. Howard confirmed. Your father's cooperation helped make the country safer during a very uncertain time. Agent Clark returned, ending their conversation. Mr. Miller, we're about to bring up one of the larger containers from the lower chamber. I thought you might want to witness it. They returned to the excavation site where a team was operating a specialized crane system. Slowly, carefully, a cylindrical container about the size of a car was lifted from the depths of the facility. Unlike the smaller containers Frank had seen earlier, this one had a more complex locking system visible on its exterior. That, Agent Clark explained quietly, contains the primary research materials. It's the reason this facility was constructed. Frank watched as the container was carefully lowered onto a custom transport platform. Teams immediately began securing it for movement. Where will it go? He asked. A modern secure facility, Agent Clark replied. One with updated safety protocols and technology. That's all I can say. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm, Frank took a final look around before heading back to town. The land that had sustained generations of his family had played a role in history he'd never imagined. In the SUV, driving back to the motel where Linda waited anxiously to hear about his visit, Frank finally asked the question that had been bothering him all day. Agent Clark, level with me. Should I be worried about farming this land again? About living there? Will it be safe for my family? The agent's expression was serious but reassuring. Mr. Miller, we would never allow you to return if there was any risk. The materials are contained, the extraction is being handled with the utmost care, and the remediation will be thorough. Your land will be as safe as it was the day before you found that hook. Maybe even safer since we'll have tested every inch of it. Frank nodded, wanting to believe him. As they drove past neighboring farms, he wondered how many other secrets might lie beneath the peaceful rural landscape, and how many other farmers like his father had quietly carried those secrets to their graves. 3 months had passed since the day Frank's plow had struck the mysterious hook. The golden hues of autumn now painted the countryside as Frank stood at the edge of his eastern field, watching the last of the government vehicles pull away. The chain-link fencing that had surrounded the site for weeks had been dismantled that morning. The white tents were gone. Even the massive hole had been filled, graded, and replanted with winter cover crops. If he hadn't lived through it himself, Frank might have believed he'd imagined the whole thing. Hard to believe it's finally over, Linda said, joining him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to him, her eyes scanning the restored landscape. Frank nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. They did a good job putting it back together. You'd never know there was anything out there, except for a few small, unobtrusive monitoring stations positioned at the field's edges. There was no visible evidence of the massive operation that had occupied their farm for the past 12 weeks. The government teams had worked methodically, extracting every container from the underground facility, removing the structure itself, and then carefully restoring the land to its original condition. "Are you ready to start farming it again?" Linda asked. Frank took a long sip of coffee before answering. "The soil tests all came back clean. The environmental team says it's safe." He paused. "But I keep thinking about what was down there all those years. While I was planting corn and soybeans, those containers were sitting right beneath, full of who knows what." Dr. Chen said there was no contamination. Linda reminded him. "Not a trace. Everything stayed sealed just like it was supposed to." Frank nodded. The government scientists had been thorough in their testing and transparent with the results. Soil samples, water testing, even air quality measurements, all had shown no cause for concern. "I know," he acknowledged. "It's just going to take some getting used to." They walked back toward the farmhouse, which felt both familiar and somehow different after their extended stay at the motel. The government compensation had allowed them to make some long overdue improvements: a new roof, updated kitchen appliances, and repairs to the barn. The farm looked better than it had in years. Inside, Frank settled at the kitchen table while Linda began preparing lunch. The folder containing copies of all the documentation related to his father's agreement with the government sat on the table where he'd left it the night before. Frank had spent hours poring over these papers, trying to understand his father's role in the whole affair. The original contract, signed in 1954, detailed the compensation arrangement and the strict confidentiality requirements. There were photos of his father with government officials during the facility's construction, looking much younger than Frank had ever known him. Most revealing were several letters his father had written to the project supervisors over the years, expressing concerns about security, asking questions about safety, and at one point, requesting reassurance about potential risks to groundwater. His father had been more engaged and vigilant than Frank had initially assumed. "He really did try to protect the farm," Frank had told Linda after discovering these letters. "He wasn't just taking their money and looking the other way." The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Linda answered it to find Agent Clark standing on their porch holding a small package. "Just making a final check-in now that the site closure is complete," he explained as Linda invited him in. "And I have something for Mr. Miller." Frank stood to greet him. Their relationship had evolved over the months from initial suspicion to something approaching mutual respect. "The last monitoring report?" Frank asked, gesturing for Clark to take a seat. "Already emailed to you," Clark replied. "Everything's exactly as it should be. You'll get quarterly reports moving forward, but you shouldn't expect any surprises." He placed the small package on the table. "This is something different. We found it during the final stages of excavation, in a sealed compartment near the primary access shaft. It had your father's name on it." Frank looked at the package with surprise. It was wrapped in simple brown paper, secured with government tape. "What is it?" "We don't know," Clark admitted. "It passed all safety screenings, but we didn't open it. It seemed personal." With careful hands, Frank unwrapped the package to reveal an old metal box about the size of a thick book. A small key was taped to the top. Using it, he unlocked the box and slowly raised the lid. Inside was a handwritten journal, a small collection of photographs, and an envelope with "For Frank" written on it in his father's distinctive handwriting. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "Son," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, it means the facility beneath our farm has been discovered, something I hoped would never happen. I've asked the project supervisors to place this box where it might be found if the site is ever excavated." Frank paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "When the government first approached me about using our land, I was young and the money they offered seemed like a fortune. Times were hard, and I saw a way to secure the farm for generations to come. What they told me seemed important, that they needed safe places to store materials vital to our national security." Frank glanced at Linda and Agent Clark, then returned to the letter. "As the years passed, I learned more about what was being stored beneath our fields. Nothing as terrible as weapons, but serious enough that I began to wonder if I'd made the right choice. I started keeping this journal, documenting everything I could learn about the facility and its contents, asking questions, demanding answers about safety. When they finally decommissioned the site in '72, I pushed for all records to be sealed. I wanted you to inherit clean land with no complications or government entanglements, Perhaps that was wrong of me. Perhaps you should have known. But I convinced myself it was all safely buried, never to be disturbed. If you're reading this now, then I failed in that regard. For that, I'm sorry. Know that I did everything in my power to ensure the land would be safe for you and your children. The journal contains everything I learned about what was stored there, knowledge that is yours by right. Whatever you might think of my decisions, please understand that I always acted out of love for you and for this land that has sustained our family for generations. Your father, Thomas. The kitchen was silent when Frank finished reading. He looked up to find Linda wiping away a tear. Even Agent Clark appeared moved. Would you like a few minutes? Clark asked, starting to rise. Frank shook his head. No, please stay. He opened the journal, flipping carefully through the yellowed pages filled with his father's neat handwriting. There were detailed notes about meetings, technical specifications of the storage facility, and meticulous records of every assurance he'd received about safety precautions. He was thorough, Frank said quietly, more thorough than I would have expected. Your father was considered highly reliable by the program administrators, Clark offered. His attention to detail is mentioned in several official reports. Frank looked at the photographs, his father standing beside men in suits at what appeared to be the construction site, another of him examining blueprints spread across their kitchen table, and one final image of him standing in the field after the work was completed, looking solemn but resolute. He carried this secret for decades, Frank said. Never shared it with anyone. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. He was protecting you, just as we've always tried to protect our children. Frank nodded, a new understanding of his father taking shape. He did what he thought was right, even when it wasn't easy. After Agent Clark departed, promising to remain available if they ever had questions, Frank and Linda took a walk around the perimeter of their property. The afternoon sun cast a golden light across the fields that stretched before them, fields that had sustained the Miller family through war and peace, hardship and prosperity. Do you think we'll ever feel the same about this place? Linda asked as they paused at the crest of the small hill that overlooked the eastern field. Frank considered the question. The land beneath their feet had been part of his life since childhood. He knew every slope, every soil variation, every spot where water gathered after heavy rains. The discovery of the facility had shaken that familiarity, introduced an element of the unknown into what had always been certain. Maybe not exactly the same, he admitted, but in some ways I feel more connected to it now. Linda looked at him questioningly. This land has a history I never knew about, Frank explained. My father faced choices I never had to make. He worried about this farm, fought for it in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. He gestured toward the horizon. Knowing what he did, the care he took, it makes me appreciate what we have even more. In the distance, they could see their neighbor Bill checking his fence line. Children played in yards along the rural road. Life in the community was returning to normal after the excitement and speculation of the past months. The story would become part of local legend, embellished with each retelling until the truth was obscured by myth. But for Frank, the reality was enough. The knowledge that beneath the ordinary surface of things often lay extraordinary stories, and that the land itself held secrets just as the people who worked it did. As the sun began to set, they walked back toward the farmhouse. Tomorrow, Frank would return to the familiar rhythm of farm life. Equipment to maintain, crops to plan for, seasons to prepare for. The monitoring stations would remain as small reminders of what had been discovered and removed, but they would fade into the background of daily life. The giant hook that had started it all was gone now, taken by the government teams for study and documentation. But Frank had kept the chain that had been attached to it, a single link cleaned and polished that now sat on his desk. A reminder of connections, visible and invisible, that tied the present to the past and his life to his father's. We'll be all right, he said as they reached the house, lights glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. This farm has survived a lot worse than government secrets. Linda smiled and took his hand. Yes, she agreed. And so have we.